Okay, we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't want to miss this conversation. Who the hell would? All right. This is going to be a really, really good show. I appreciate everybody tuning in. Make sure before we get started, go subscribe to Jonathan Sheffield's YouTube channel right here. This guy is one of the coolest Christians on planet Earth. Okay. Seriously, he made my intro that you're going to see in just a second. Go subscribe, show him some love, show him that we humanists know how to show love. Okay. Show him that. Also, richardcarrier.info. This website here, his blog, everything, you can go help him out on his Patreon. You can take college courses online. You can give him, if you want to you can hire him for a task. I mean, like, there are ways in which you can utilize his skills, and trust me, he's got them skills. Yeah, I got skills. What are you going to do about it? You ever seen that clip on YouTube? That's what it reminds me of. Richard Carrier is a boss when it comes to this stuff. Also, the Patreon. This is how I feed my family and keep the lights on. And you can access tons of videos you can't find anywhere else. And they're Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Dennis R. McDonald, Doctor, all over the place on MythVision Patreon. Please go help support us. Let's grow this thing. Let's keep MythVision alive so I can keep looking at my wife and saying, but I'm working. And she can go, and then I'm working. You see what I'm saying? You're helping me. You're helping me give an excuse and win an argument, because we men never win these arguments. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have Dr. Richard Carrier. Welcome to MythVision.
Glad to be here again, as always.
And my good friend, Jonathan Sheffield. What's up, my brother?
Thanks for having me again, Derek. And it's a pleasure once again to have a dialogue with Dr. Carrier.
Yeah,
I'm excited. Definitely. You guys, seriously, this is not like a formal, get your gloves on and it'll be an interesting discussion. I don't want to be in the way of you guys when you have this conversation. I'll start us off with a little bit of questioning. And then I know it's like the snowball effect. The questions will come naturally. I will take, if you guys are cool with it, I'll take super chats during, and maybe throughout I'll find like a window. But if for whatever reason I don't get to their super chat here, I'll make sure at the end that I address them all. I'll screenshot them so I don't miss any super chats, and I'll save them for the end. So awesome. Let's start off. I'll go ahead and put it on to Jonathan here. Jonathan, tell us, what are you trying to propose when it comes to the book of Daniel? What's your whole point in writing this article?
Okay. First, I think the goal of the article was really to build on my previous arguments from the debate I had with Dr. Jim Majors and Dr. Josh Bowen. With a special emphasis on Josephus' report on the presentation of Daniel to the Macedonian king Alexander in 332 BC. Now, to give you a little bit of the backstory, I was very interested in Dr. Carrier participating in this project because, once again, I think as a historian and as a philosopher, he brings a lot of great insights into history. So, my engagement with Dr. Carrier after we had a discussion on explain apologetics with Dr. Stephen Boyce and Samuel Nissan was, hey, let me go ahead and pursue my thesis, that Josephus' report presents the simplest explanation as to why Alexander did not capture Jerusalem. And to that end, just because there wasn't a whole lot of time I had with Dr. Richard Carrier, because he was doing a review, I was like, well, let me outline, some of the circumstantial evidence to kind of go ahead and set this. Let's go ahead and grab all these facts or substantial facts from my view that leads me at least to believe that we can infer and kind of corroborate the fact in question. So, for me personally, I thought it was strange that Alexander didn't initiate a conquest of Jerusalem or, install a Greek occupation. And I think what makes this conversation a little more interesting is, once again, we have another report from Josephus with respect to
Jonathan,
Jerusalem.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Do me a favor. Pull your mic away from your mouth just so we don't hear that. There's a little bit of and we want to hear what you want to say. I just don't want everybody who's listening to keep hearing it. And sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no problem at all. My wife tells me that all the time, so I hear it all the time. So is that better?
Oh yeah, huge. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, then we have this other report that goes to Jerusalem's survival. And, from my perspective, it appears once again we have, if it's true, we have another, good explanation that Cyrus's decree, returning the Jews from exile, allowing them to rebuild their temple amidst all this kind of pressure from the neighboring nations to fortify Jerusalem. So I have two things that I really want to investigate. And Dr. Carrier is a great historian. He provides great insight. So let me engage him in a project, knowing that, hey, some things may be wrong. Some things I may be very gullible on. I am a Christian. I am an Anglican. There are certain theological positions I hold to. But let's go at these questions. And I think one of the interesting thing I did pull into the argument was the background argument. This thing that I observe with the history of the Jews, specifically related to the Bible of Jerusalem, there are other, big thinkers that I've been influenced by, such as Nikolai Berdyaev, Mark Twain, that seems to provide some insights into some of the things that I see. Now, once again, we can all be wrong. It's coming from my perspective, but I I have looked at some of this stuff, and I was just saying, wow, this is strange. Now, I do want to let everyone know this doesn't naturally default to a God hypothesis. Doesn't mean anything supernatural is possible. But what I'm saying here is, can we give the Jewish voices or the relevant witness, the Jews here, an opportunity to speak and investigate the veracity of the claims? If they're true, does that mean that there's an observable black swan that we need to engage? Or is it a mirage, maybe, that we see? Maybe that's a good word to use. Maybe a mirage that our senses are seeing. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Carrier to give some of his thoughts and insights.
Yeah, it's always valuable to see this. That's one of the things I like about our collaborations is that you actually present like good, concise analysis of what you believe and why, right? So that and it's like sincere, and it can actually go in and like analyze the logic of what you're arguing, and so that actually makes it much more effective, rather than gamesmanship or rhetoric and things like that I often have to deal with Christian apologists. So I actually I like working with you on this stuff. Of course, I disagree with all of it, right? So I think it's the other way around. Obviously, I think there are much simpler explanations for the courses of events that are already presented in the records, and we already know that. Like it is the typical feature of religious literature to be propagandistic and make stuff up. Especially things that are convenient to the people who are composing these documents. So when Josephus alone, he's the only source who does this, and this is hundreds of years later, right after the facts. When he alone has two stories that are identical like this, where Jewish scriptures are shown to these great leaders, Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, the two greats that interacted with the Jews of that time. When he alone shows two of these stories where they show him a book, a prophecy prophesying how great they are, and then they go, oh, that's amazing, and then they shower all these benefits on the Jews, right? So that is definitely in Josephus's self-interest to invent these stories, or any other author that he might be using as a source, although he doesn't mention a source for any of this, and none of the other Jewish sources mention these versions of events either. I don't find that realistic. Like, I don't think that's how Cyrus or Alexander would react to some schmoes showing up with a book. Hey, look, we have a book that proves that you're going to be the conqueror. It's like, oh my God, that's amazing. No, they'd be like, yeah, sure you did. Right. Whatever. So I don't find it realistic, but also in the sources that we have, especially the more reliable sources that are closer to, or citing sources that are closer to the events, already give us explanations. I mean, the in both cases, the Jews surrendered, right? So, or in Cyrus's case, he had an empire-wide policy that benefited all the ethnic groups. There was nothing special about the way the Jews were treated. Everybody got the same treatment. And he describes and explains why he did that. That was actually a policy of magnanimity for the purposes of getting people to be more compliant with his reign and to be more profitable so they could produce more taxes. So it was actually a completely sensible reason. And he says this right himself. So we actually have it from the horse's mouth, as it were. So we don't need this. In fact, it doesn't do any work. The Isaiah story doesn't do any work causally. Like if he's doing it for everybody, clearly it wasn't just the Jews who showed up with a book and convinced him to be nice to them. Like, no, this was a general empire-wide policy from which the Jews benefited. That's the simplest explanation. And same with Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great did his conquests, he had the carrot and stick strategy that all great conquerors used, which is that, look, you can surrender, pay tribute, and then I'll leave you alone, or you can resist and I'll crush you. And so that's what he did. I mean, so when he gets to, we have actual accounts that that Jerusalem elite surrendered. They actually paid tribute, gave him soldiers, and the whole deal. So it's like that. There's no reason for him to have besieged the Jews, and so there's no further explanation needed. And then that's the basic structure of my response. And then there's, of course, all the little minutia of other specific details about your case that I went into in my response article, including the background point about how the Jews are special, which isn't true. I don't think there's anything particularly. I mean, every ethnicity's history is unique, so uniqueness is not a special property in and of itself. But the specific events that have happened throughout Jewish history have ordinary causal explanations. There's nothing supernatural or amazing about it. And also that has nothing to do with whether their authors are any more reliable than other human beings. I mean, the basic principle of non-racism is everybody's the same. So humans are shady in general, prone to propaganda and whatnot, and prone to gullibility too, right? So like it's possible Josephus heard these stories and just believed them. I from other evidence in Josephus's scholarship, as I cite in my previous article, other scholars have noted that Josephus is actually a bit shady in his misrepresentation of history. So he's also probably using some poor sources as well, but he himself does not seem to be a particularly reliable actor in all of this. And there's particular political reasons for that too, that Josephus has a shady history as well. So I think the simplest explanation is Josephus just made these stories up. And when we look at the historical analysis, the way we would do it with multiple source analysis, chronological analysis, background fact analysis, and so on, we don't need these myths to explain the course of events.
Now, I think one of the things I want to bring up, and once again, I appreciate your engagement on this point. I think in your article, what I did appreciate, because sometimes I don't see this level of engagement from others, was right. Was the thought process of, well, your theory possibly goes to that there's this other Daniel, or the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and Jonathan, it looks like you established a really good case of motive.
Right. I didn't mention that just now, but that's a good point. Keep going.
Yeah.
This is a whole one of those side issues that came up. But yeah, go ahead.
And so first, I think it's a great point because it establishes motive. And once again, we are all people, and sometimes in desperate situations results in desperate measures.
So I guess I should explain for people who haven't read the articles, right? Who don't know what we're talking about.
Which they should. Yeah. If you could go over that. The
articles are great. And one of the things, I mean, this is another digression, but one of the things I love about this is that it gets me to go into the reasons for our methodology and pointing out where I think your methodology goes wrong and why in an abstract way, which I think makes it a good teaching tool. If we just dismiss it, we don't get to dive into these and explain well, why do we do it? Why do historians do things this way rather than another? But to get to the point here is there are some scholars. So the mainstream scholarly view is that Daniel was forged in the 2nd century BC as war propaganda for the Maccabean War. But there are some scholars, and they're taken seriously, who argue that the first half of Daniel, books 1 to 6, might have been forged earlier. So it might have been forged in the 4th century. And there's some evidence they bring for that. And that books 7 to 12 were added on in the 2nd century. And then, of course, more books were added later, 13 and 14 and so on. But so that's one view. And consequently, there is an established mainstream hypothesis out there that the chapters 1 to 6 could have existed when Alexander showed up, and that book could have, that version of it could have been shown to him. It would lack chapters 7 to 12, however, which is the chapters that Christians most need for their foundational teachings. And so like your defense of it would, at best, I pointed out, suggest that they forged 1 to 6, Daniel 1 to 6, specifically to try and persuade Daniel to leave them alone, right? So like using your own theory, like your own internal logic, it doesn't actually get us around the problem of how do we establish Daniel predates the 4th century, which it purports to do. It purports to have been written in the early 5th century, right? 6th century. I'm forgetting.
Yes.
7th century, 600, around 600 BC is when it purports to have been written, shortly after 600, basically, 6th century BC. So that there wasn't even evidence for that particular thing, and I don't endorse that. I don't think they forged Daniel 1 to 6 to try and persuade Daniel, because I don't think anybody would try that. That would be a sure fail methodology. Daniel or Alexander would not be impressed by this, but anyway, in terms of your internal logic, that was one of the points I made, and so you were about to talk about that. So set people up. And
I thought it was a good point, and once again, it's where Dr. Carrier likes to engage the argument. And so let me walk you through some of my thought process. And once again, this is how I was looking at the situation. First, I think one of the points where we both agree, I think if the Jews would have done something like that, it spells ultimate disgrace. Just because he would have had counsel with him, he had historians, he would have been able to consult them, like, are they trying to push something over on my eyes? And to think about it, that he has Athenians there, which really didn't like him that much, and others, it's like, this guy is being hoodwinked by the Jews. I
would think he wouldn't even need advisors, right? So like, we both know that the Egyptian oracle of Amun did the same thing, right? So I'm sure Alexander promoted that. He says, "Oh, look, the oracle of Amun says, this is great." I think if the Jews had presented him an oracle like that, he would have used that too. He said, "Oh yeah, look, another oracle has confirmed that I'm going to be the ruler of the world." But that would be his propaganda. Like it wouldn't move his decisions politically. He's going to do the same thing. He's going to do the same policy as ever. But he would use that as sort of extra boost to promote it, essentially. So I think both could happen in conjunction, right? They could say, "Hey, our oracle predicted you'll be the ruler of the world, and we're surrendering, and we're going to give you all this tribute and help you out." Both could have happened at the same time. That's entirely plausible history, and Alexander would be responding to both in conjunction, right? So it wouldn't be a situation where, no, we're not surrendering to you. Here's a book that says you're going to conquer the world. Leave us alone. That would not have worked, and is not what happened, right? So that's my take on it. That's where I'm coming from on that.
Now, here's the difficulty with me coming to that ledge, and one of the things that I look at on the Orthodox Jewish canon is, we do understand the Septuagint coming into the Greek-speaking world. We understand that there was a number of Hellenistic writings, especially with Daniel. When we look at like Bel and the Dragon, Susanna and Daniel, and even though I think they bring great intellectual insight into the mind of the Hellenistic Greeks, what I find odd is, okay, if it came in the 2nd century or afterwards, or if they were adding on, one of the problems I have is, when we look at the Orthodox Jewish canon, these Hellenistic writings, they come into the Septuagint, they're floating around other words, they come into Christianity. There's other parts of Daniel that comes in, and we don't see that in the Orthodox Jewish canon. And then we have these groups. So, and just to talk about two of the big ones, so the disagreement between Hillel and Shammai. So you have two big Jewish groups in the 1st century. They really don't like each other. They have different views on the oral law, but they both, occupy the same Orthodox Jewish canon. So one of the things I'm trying to get around is, if I look, apart from what Josephus maybe claims about, okay, well, the Jewish Orthodox Jewish canon from the time of Xerxes, has been pure. It's been preserved. We didn't add anything or take anything away. Why do we see all these Hellenistic writings coming into like the Septuagint and these others, but not the Jewish canon, if there's this tendency where they're building upon Daniel with these other sections of the book?
Yeah, I mean, this is again an example of this is all later mythology, right? So at the time, certainly before Hillel and Shammai, there was no Jewish canon. The only thing that would be canonical would have been the Pentateuch. That was fixed in stone. But the prophets and the historians, the other sections of the Tanakh, were very fluid. And there was no decision made on which ones would be officially accepted, frankly, until after the Jewish War. It was hundreds of years later. So this idea of the scriptures being pure, of course, that's what they're always going to propagandistically claim. The Christians claim that too of their own Bible, even though there were tons of other New Testaments floating around that even predated theirs in some cases. So yeah, they always claim that, but we know that's not the actual history. We look at Qumran, for example, and we see tons of other books being treated as if they were canonical, as if they were the Word of God. And so in that particular time, we're talking the 2nd century BC, during this time of war. And we also have this precedent that we see a lot of times, is lost books suddenly getting discovered at convenient times. This is a common thing. We see this in Roman religious history as well. And this happens a lot in religious history. Deuteronomy has a story. You look in the King's literature. They just suddenly discovered the lost book of Deuteronomy that was sitting in the temple, and no one noticed it until conveniently when it supported their particular legal reforms. So that trend happens, right? And we don't actually have the literature. We don't have like relevant political literature. We only have the propaganda from the Maccabean period. We don't have like people arguing about what's going on at the time. We don't have opposition documents on this. So we don't know what opposition was saying, or what. We don't know any of that. So we don't know. We don't even know what they were doing to promote Daniel during this time. So we don't have the proclamations. Oh, look, we found this book, or even conversely, well, as it has always been said, you've seen this book for centuries, and it says this. We don't see that either, right? We don't have any. We just don't have access to what was going on in terms of the way they sold this book. And so all we can go on is precedent, what usually happens. And so when we look at the evidence that it was forged in the Maccabean period is overwhelming, like it's exceedingly strong, which is why all mainstream scholars agree with this now. So then it's just a question of, well, there are many different ways that could have happened, and we don't have any evidence by which to rule any of those ways out. So where we end up in critical method is it's a 2nd century forgery, possibly the 1st section, 4th century, but that's still debated or uncertain in the field.
Okay. Another thing that you brought up, and I want to explain a little bit more of my background in the sense of why I chose, when I was looking at the analysis, to say, well, why am I going to use the Jewish scroll of fasting, the Babylonian Talmud? Why am I going to bring in Origin now? And so my thought process was this, Dr. Carrier, is first we have a report from Josephus that describes this, but we also have all these other documents that seem to point to maybe one section of the report, and the way I was looking at it is almost like a circumstantial case,
Once again, to get people up to speed, what Jonathan's referring to is that there were many legends about how Alexander interacted with the Jews during his conquests, and we find he mentions the scroll of fasting mentions this. The Talmud has stories and so on, and those versions don't mention the Book of Daniel being involved. So what you're talking about is why you still think they're relevant as maybe like triangulation of some kind. And of course, my response, what my response to that, but I'll let you continue. So,
oh yeah, and this is just to give you kind of my thought process, because I was thinking, okay, well, if I look at the Jewish scroll of fasting, the context of it, from what I understand is it's just a chronicle which enumerates like 35 eventful days in the Jewish nation where something wonderful happened from those groups. Now, I know from the document itself and the Talmud, there's at least a person of interest identified in terms of authorship and possible dating around the Tanaic period. But the one thing I was establishing, I was like, okay, well, if any of the story is going to be true, can we establish any link between Alexander and the Jews? And all this report does is say that there was some sort of meeting. And then when I look at the Babylonian Talmud, it was interesting when I looked at Yoma 69, and I was thinking, okay, well, right here, we're having a rabbinic discussion because the question is being raised, okay, about priestly vestments, when they can be worn, can they be worn outside the temple? And then the response comes back, well, we have this situation, which refers back to the Jewish scroll of fasting where, the high priest came out. So then I begin to connect, okay, well, then they have this procession that comes out to meet Alexander. Alexander pays homage to the Jewish god. And then, you kind of have this element in there of a Jew, with the Samaritans that, oh, these are the people that rebelled against you. So then it starts putting together this kind of, okay, well, I have a street camera on this corner and then this one. So the guy who killed him maybe passed by this angle. So what I was trying to build is, we have a response from Origen that kind of ties back to Josephus's report from his discussion with Celsus on, okay, there was this ask from Alexander, there was this denial from the Jews, which seems consistent with what we see with Tyre, where they didn't want to offend Darius. So we had this element, and the other part that I had brought in was, we have Judea. And even though I do think Ecateus of Adepta may have been stretching his figures, what I almost like how Xenophon says, there was 1 million Persians. It's like, well, no, it wasn't 1 million. It's probably much less. But we have the elements where there was possibly resources. He had this big, long siege. He's asking a Persian ally for support at a time when the war is impending. And then the Jews tell him no. And then all of a sudden at Gaza, they get real scared. There's some sort of movement. They come out to meet him in an attempt for the high priest to preserve the Jewish people, which leads to this event. So and once again, you reviewed my article and you went over this, but if you can explain some of the audience, some of your thoughts on that and your response as well.
Right. Yeah. It's again, as an example of an opportunity to teach like how historians do things like this. We know, like we can prove, this isn't speculation. We know that Origen used Josephus a lot. Origen was a big fan of Josephus, employed the manuscripts of Josephus in his arguments. So the fact that Origen would refer to this story in Josephus is what we call non-independent attestation. So it's not an independent corroboration. It's just someone repeating something that we already know. So Origen cannot support Josephus. Now, it would have been different if Origen had said, well, Josephus says this, and here's this other source that says this. Like if Origen had multiple sources and they were, then it would be a different analysis. But Origen, no, we know he's using Josephus. He doesn't mention any other source for this. So it just is a copy of a story already told. It doesn't corroborate. So we can't use Origen. We have to throw him out. It's not usable for confirming the story itself. And the other versions, the Scroll of Fasting version, and more interestingly, the Talmudic version, and that's a version that gets written or edited over centuries, and multiple rabbis are involved in adding to the Talmud and composing it over time. And for people who don't know, the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah, which in legend were all the laws and rulings of Moses that were handed down orally. And even the Mishnah, theoretically, apparently wasn't written down until after the Jewish War. So this itself is already a late text. And then the Talmud is a commentary on that, so that's even later. But nonetheless, a lot of the authorities that are quoted might actually come from literature predating that. So when they say Rabbi so-and-so said this, it is possible that they had writings from that rabbi or about that rabbi that they were pulling sections from, because we have a lot of other things like this, like Greek commentaries on Greek sources will do this. They'll cut passages out of other lost books, which is how we know a lot of literature that's been lost, how we know what was in it and stuff like that. So it is possible they had earlier sources. But whether they did or not, there's no Book of Daniel. So in the Talmudic version, there's actually 3 versions of what happened. The 2 most salient are the realpolitik explanation, which is that they surrendered and Alexander did the usual thing. He says, okay, let's make a deal. You're saving me trouble and giving me money and resources. That's cool. That's how I roll. And so that's what happened. The other version is that he had a dream in which God, it's in various ways, revealed to him and convinced him to accept the surrender of the Jews and so on. That's already not a plausible story. But the fact that that's the story that they tell means that they were not yet aware of Daniel. Their myth that they were familiar with was that Alexander had a dream. And so there's no Book of Daniel convincing him in that. They hadn't heard of it. And there's a particular reason why that might be. Actual Jewish authors were not so hot about Josephus because they considered him a traitor. So and also he's writing, in Greek. So they were less interested in pulling anything from Josephus. That's why you find very little reference to Josephus in the Talmudic literature, that he was not one of them in their eyes generally. So it's possible they never even read Josephus, but if they did, they clearly didn't credit his story because they didn't include it in their version of events. And so this is what we talk about in history, is like, this is corroborating evidence that Josephus made it up. Right. So this is when we look at the multiple sources, we see, this new thing that only arises in Josephus. When we trace the common roots of the story, that detail is not there in what we call the archetype of the story. It only appears in later versions of the story. Well, one, which is Josephus. So as we do analysis, that's how we triangulate in history. We end up with the opposite conclusion that you do.
I also want to get your thoughts, at least in establishing some of the, I guess, French benefits that the Jews possibly received. And when I looked at, obviously, Josephus, who's quoting Hecataeus of Adepta, he refers to him on many different accounts, but in reference to the benefits procured by the Jews, first, he mentioned, the Jews served as allies with Alexander in the campaigns, which ties back to an element of Josephus' report on Alexander asking, do any of the Jews want to come in and, serve in my army? And then they have the benefits that get laid out where, he brings them over to Alexandria. He establishes equal privileges with the Macedonians. And Josephus does appeal to a series of documents, the epistles of King Alexander and Ptolemy. So I want to get your thoughts on some of that documentation coming from Josephus' citation of Hecataeus. So what are your thoughts on some of the documents he refers to?
He never credits this Daniel legend to Hecataeus. So Josephus
Correct.
never says that Hecataeus wrote that they presented this book to Alexander. So as a historian, that's not usable information. I mean, yeah, sure, maybe there was a genuine work of Hecataeus on the Jews written in the 4th century that Josephus used as a source. Josephus says he did in other places, but he doesn't credit Hecataeus with this particular thing. So we can't use it, unfortunately. It would have been more helpful if Josephus had been more meticulous about citing his sources when he had them, but there's a reason he doesn't, is because Josephus wants to be able to get away with making stuff up, so he can't be meticulously citing sources all the time. He wants his style to be, I'm going to present stories. Some of them you're going to find in other literature, wink, wink, and then I'm going to give you more stories. And so you can't tell the difference between the ones I'm making up and stuff. So if he had gone through and meticulously cited a source for every story, then the ones that he made up would stick out like a sore thumb because they would be uncited, right? So I think that's one of the reasons Josephus is not being so meticulous about his methodology. He wants cover for the stories he makes up, which were more than these stories. There's just a lot of stuff is fishy in Josephus, and for particular propagandistic reasons. There's a large scholarship on analyzing the rhetoric of Josephus and his propagandistic means and methods and goals and stuff like that. So, so Hecatius is not terribly usable. It's also a problem that we're not really sure there was a Hecatius on the Jews. It's possible that's fake as well. Now, I'm not convinced of that, but I'm also not convinced of the reverse. I think the evidence is undecided, right? So I would never rely on a premise that it was fake, but I would not be entirely reliant on a premise that it was authentic either, right? So it leaves us in a sort of uncertain no man's land, which as an ancient historian, I was trained to be very comfortable with, because we're stuck in this I don't know scenario a lot about ancient history. So you got to get used to it if we're doing this work. So that is familiar to me, that being in that place. But yeah, it's a frustrating situation. But since we can't tie the story to Hecatius, then that particular detail is not usable, unfortunately.
What are your thoughts? Because one of the mainstream arguments, or some of the arguments that are out there, and it's not just yours. I do see Christians using this argument when I brought it up. Is the later pagan histories of Alexander do not reference this event. Now, which I do get. Now, I'm not saying that, okay, well, we're just going to draw our conclusion from that silence. But one of the things, and while I am going back to Josephus, he does make what appears to be an empirical observation that he speaks to specifically in his writings in Against Apian about many of the Greek writers not mentioning the Jews for, and we do understand the anti-Semitism, throughout history, but he seems to appeal to that. And he does give an example between two historians of the period. One wrote on them, being Hecatius, and the other one not mentioning the Jews, to show this trend.
Yeah. I don't comment much on that in my article because I don't think I think it's too much of a digression. And I actually have one paragraph on the general concept of what you're talking about, which is a methodological point, which is what that is an attempt to explain the absence of evidence. So logically, I don't even have to address whether that explanation works or not, because even if it was correct, all that leaves us with is still no evidence, right? So it's like, it doesn't matter how many excuses one makes up for why the evidence doesn't exist. The evidence still doesn't exist. So it's actually not a helpful device, really. There are times when that kind of argument can be useful for building another argument, but it doesn't work in this case. It doesn't help. So even if the premise is true, it doesn't get us anywhere in this particular case. But I also find the premise dubious. There is truth in that there were there's a lot of dismissiveness. I wouldn't put it like jealousy. I think that's a propagandistic thing for Josephus to say. No, I think it's just disinterest. It's like, who are these hicks? Who cares, right? Like, we're going to talk about Egypt. Who cares about this little province next to Egypt? No one cares about. They're constantly getting stomped. Like, who cares about these guys? So I think that's what happens. If you look at Arian, for example, I don't know that he mentions it much, but he would have done had the generals of Alexander mentioned it. And because he's getting his information from eyewitnesses, the people who were there, basically. And so I think even they thought that this was such a minor incident. And you have to admit, there were tons of these minor incidents. Like there's hundreds of cities and little kingdoms and stuff that Alexander conquered that we don't find mentioned in the sources, even though we know he ran over them. Or struck a deal with them or whatever. So what they do, the historians pick on the things that they think are important to mention, or that are important to them, or they think will be important to their audience. So Egypt is a big deal. So obviously, going to talk all about Egypt, and so that's why the Amun oracle gets mentioned in there. I would think the odds would favor them mentioning the oracle coming out of Judea as well, because they already have the big oracle, the fancy one from Egypt is already backing them. So they could have thrown in, oh yeah, and then they look at all these other oracles, and here's another one over here, and this minor temple god also gave an oracle, etc. I don't think it's like impossible. I don't think they would ignore that. I'm sure Alexander would use that as propaganda for that particular region, indeed. And so I think it would end up in the history books, even if it was dismissive, like, oh, a Penny Ante oracle. But nonetheless, we got the one from Ammon, and here we got this other one. There's an example that we have, which is the Zalmoxis cult, right? So there's in Herodotus. This is a classic example of what we're talking about. Is Herodotus mentions that there's this cult among the Thracians, which is Celts above Greece, and this is back in 5th century BC. And Herodotus is saying, there were these Thracians who believed in Zalmoxis, who died and came back and promised them eternal life if they had like communal meals, and he gives this whole story. And then he goes, but the Greeks say, and then he gives this whole polemical teardown of the Zalmoxis cult with making fun of them and say, oh yeah, he just faked his death. He borrowed all his ideas from Pythagoras. It was all a scam, etc. We get that. So that this is a group that are really scoffing and belittling the Thracians. And what they do is not ignore them. What they do is they make up a polemical version of events, and then Josephus or Herodotus gives us both, right? So you could see, you probably would have encountered the same thing with the Jews, where they would tell the oracle story, but in a mocking way, like, oh yeah, these Penny Ante people with their little thing. So it doesn't automatically follow that they would just ignore them, but it is also entirely plausible that they would ignore them, thinking that it just wasn't important enough to write down. So, but that doesn't tell us anything about what actually happened, right? Because they're not writing it down doesn't basically cuts us off from access to what actually happened, because the eyewitnesses who could have told us haven't told us. So whether it was jealousy or indifference or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? That's my general response. So I didn't have to go into particulars on that in my article.
No, that's a good point. I think a couple other things that I kind of noticed about Jerusalem, and taking into the analysis is, one of Alexander's key generals, or one of his generals, Ptolemy, did take Jerusalem afterwards, 3 years after his death, which, in my mind, okay, well, why the difference in philosophy? Obviously, just like we see today, and not saying that presidents are always listen to their generals, because we don't, and I think we see this in the media today and everywhere else. But that was one of my nagging inconsistencies: is why do we see that difference? Obviously, we see hundreds of years later the Secludians, the descendants of Alexander, going to make a conquest of Jerusalem, and then we see this difference with Alexander philosophically. And once again, we do see that politically happen even nowadays. I was just watching down the news, with Afghanistan. But I want to get your thoughts on that, just from the military perspective.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at the history, especially around Nebuchadnezzar, right, the period where the Jews were constantly switching sides between the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And so you have this constant back and forth where they betray the people they pledge allegiance to and join the other guys. And then when things go bad, they betray those guys and then rejoin the other guys, right? So there's a lot of this back and forth realpolitik going on in Jerusalem. They're trying to figure out who to side with. And I mean, obviously, once Alexander died, there were a lot of regions that tried to rebel at that moment. And so the Diadochoi, who are the successors of Alexander, had to go out and like reconquer some of these regions, basically put their foot down to sort of stop these rebellions. And so, I mean, obviously that suggests that's what the Jews did too, is to say, wow, okay, this is our chance to throw the yoke off. And then, then the Seleucids come in and say, no, we're consolidating this. And then, of course, they were terrible rulers. Like the Seleucids were the worst of all of them. And it's like a classic example of like their empire just shrinks gradually over time because they were just so bad at governing, by all accounts, right? That's so as opposed to the Ptolemies, who remained pretty powerful. They did try expansions that didn't work, but their control of Egypt remained solid all the way up until the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And that was literally the last province in the Mediterranean that the Romans had to take down to really consolidate their empire. Eventually, of course, they logged in Judea, but even when like in 6 AD, but Judea, even in the 30s BC, Judea was already a paying tributarian to the Roman Empire. They were a client kingdom, so they were already basically submitted to the empire at that point. And the Ptolemies were the last ones. But yes, that's what I think was going on there. The Jews just switched sides or decided to try and throw the yoke off, and the Seleucids stomped on them. They didn't try that when Alexander was alive, because they made a treaty with him and things were going well at that point, at least as well as could be expected. So I think that's the sequence of events there. We don't need any other further explanation. It's a typical sequence of events that we saw happen throughout Alexander's empire.
Okay. Now, one of the other points I was bringing up, and it does segue into a point about how we look at numbers from the ancient world. So I'll definitely allow you to speak on it. Is part of my case was to build that Judea was bountiful. He had this long 7-month siege going on. He needed resources he was employing, and Judea marked a spot where he can get resources to support that would tie back to the argument that, just like Tyre kind of assumed that the war's not over, you still got to beat Darius in the east, and you may have 100,000 people. I don't think your 40,000 can beat him. We're just not going to play those odds yet. We're cool over here. Hopefully the Carthaginians come to our aid. So we're good. Now, I use Ecateus's report. Now, once again, I do agree that obviously they're not the statistical geniuses that we are today, and I'm not saying that they are Trump numbers. That look how big it is. Maybe that is so, but here's the thing. So if I'm looking at those records, and I'm saying, okay, well, maybe he didn't mean 120. Maybe he just says a lot of people from what he sees, and then he sees all these villages throughout Judea. Now, yeah, the number does seem high, and you brought up a really good point about irrigation and water, and the animals need to drink too. Now, one of the things in the Assyrian records is from the Assyrian king is he makes this boast that, okay, well, during his conquest of Judea, not only I destroyed these 46 strongholds, but, some big, some small, but I captured over 200,000 people, men and women, that I counted. So when we look at numbers like that historically, because then it would say, well, if in 701 BC, Jerusalem was that big, what's to say 200-300 years later, after they're coming back from exile, that the land becomes populous, they go back to their farming, and they at least had 3 sources of water by 701 with Hezekiah's tunnel and the pool to support that type of civilization. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I did, obviously, like you mentioned, I did cover that in the article with some citations on it too. Historians now, the way we do this, we do what's called aerial surveys. So we use aerial surveys and coordinate that with on-the-ground provenance excavation, essentially. And when we combine those two things, we can actually determine what the agricultural capacity was at particular times, based on the type of agriculture and the fertility of the land and the quantity of the land and so on. So we can actually establish upper limits that you can't feed more than so many people. And also water is the same thing. It doesn't matter if you have 3 sources. There's a flow rate. There's only so much quantity you can get out of the ground at a particular time. And they didn't have desalination plants back then. So this puts an upper limit. And that's why one of the reasons when the Romans came in, they built an aqueduct to Jerusalem specifically so the population could grow. And that's actually one of the reasons they did that, so they could port water from somewhere else in there. And the Romans did this for cities a lot. So cities grew rather large under the Roman Empire, that for this particular reason that they had the hydro economy was impressive. They were really doing what the Chinese were doing at the same time. And so that allowed explosions of population. But when I say explosion of population, it's still nowhere near that. As I pointed out, even at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, like so at the height of water technology that we had at that time, Jerusalem was 15,000. That's it. And so that's and there's indications of water economy and stuff that it couldn't even been half that in before the Roman aqueduct came in. So we have limits on Jerusalem, but that's Jerusalem. And then Judea is limited by capacity there. And you can exceed capacity a little bit if you can really do well with trade. And so if you import a lot of your food, so that's like the city of Rome was not surviving on its own lands. It was importing shit tons of grain from Egypt, right? To keep the huge, and it was a very huge, we have a lot of good data on how huge Rome was. Rome was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, definitely approaching 1 million population, which is incredible at the time. But we see this massive economy supporting it, so it's totally plausible. That wasn't going on in Judea. The max support that you could find in Judea was 50,000 for the whole region. And remember, like only maybe a quarter of that at best are going to be able-bodied fighters. And I think that's probably, I'm being too generous, is probably closer to like, an eighth or something. And so this region, and so what would happen, like when Alexander was besieging Tyre, even insofar he needed to even go into the Judean region for supplies, he would have just been doing it. So, there's a difference between Jerusalem, nervously watching Alexander go and loot or requisition supplies, slaves, or whatever. I mean, that's just what would happen. They go, well, okay, this is happening. We need a solution here. And so one of the obvious ones is let's make a treaty so that he's more nice about it. Basically, is what would be the real politic of that situation. And if you're smart, they're like, well, we can't fight this guy, so let's make a deal with him. That's a better, and he offers deals. He's a deal maker. So that's why it makes sense for them to do that. And then of course, indeed, support the siege of Tyre. With regard to, you mentioned the number fudging. So there's a number of reasons why we don't trust ancient sources and numbers. Now, the Sennacherib thing, I don't think the 200,000 was for Jerusalem or even Judea. I think that was for like the whole eastern region. So that I think, I can't remember the exact what his exact wording is, but I don't think the stele contains the claim, or the pyramid contains the claim that he took 200,000 from Judea. I think it was from a much wider, because he was fighting multi-front wars all over the place. So I think that's what the number comes from. But it's also possible that the official records added a zero, or what we would call add a zero. We fully would expect that. That's not like who's going to count to challenge him, right? So we don't implicitly trust those numbers either. Sometimes we can corroborate them independently, and so we know when they're reliable. But the historians are the worst. The historians, they're always adding a zero. It's so common. And then we have the second problem of scribal transmission. A lot of these numbers have been distorted because numbers are one of the most common places scribes screw up. And it's easy for a simple error to make a huge difference in the number. So numbers are one of the most poorly preserved aspects of these manuscripts. We have some exceptions, so it's not like they all are tanked, but we have to question the numbers, because we can't trust necessarily that even what the author wrote has been transmitted down to us. We can't trust that the author had any reliable sources, like he's just exaggerating or making something up. So that's why we don't just implicitly trust numbers in text. We look for corroborating evidence when and where we can, and a lot of it's based on plausibility. Like, what was the agricultural capacity of Judea? What was the water supply flow rate available at the time? So so we do those analyses, and so we get to other numbers that are match the archaeological record.
No, that's helpful. I think, let's see, because I know we've covered several of the points. I do want to provide a little background, and hopefully some of the audience has read the articles, because once again, Dr. Carrier does a really great write-up.
I'd love to hear questions from the audience about the articles, as also what we brought up today. I mean, we've expanded a little bit beyond what we did in the articles here, so.
Yeah, if we could get some thoughts on the articles, because once again, I think, and from the very beginning of my engagement with Dr. Carrier, I think the articles allow us to expand more on our points, get our ideas out there, big or small, have a better discussion than coming on and kind of trying to talk through 30 minutes.
It gives the opportunity for precise wording, for structure, and for citations. That's why I love doing, way prefer doing debates and exchanges on in writing, because it's more information dense. You get people have to sit and read it, but it's also for that reason better organized, better vetted. Like you'll leave out things that you think, if you're like spontaneously talking, like even I do this, like I think like afterwards, like I wasn't entirely accurate in the way I stated that, right? So like if you do it off of the top of your head, you'll forget things. You might be less precise and so on. And so I much prefer these formats, and I'm so glad that you've been supporting this project of doing them from time to time. I would like to see more people invest in that.
Yeah, and I think from the Christian's perspective, and I kind of told Dr. Carrier this a long time ago, and I know in my conversations with Derek as well. I think it's important for Christian apologists to at least attempt to regain or engage in intellectual argument, have a much more academic discussion. When I look at the history of Christianity, whether we'll agree with Augustine of Hippo or Tertullian of Carthage, but when you look at those figures, they were trying to engage in academic discussion with the groups they were involved in. So, and I think a lot from my perspective, since the Enlightenment, the evangelical scholarship has kind of shied away from actually addressing it. And one of the great things about Dr. Carrier is he has opened up his forum for actual academic discussion with those that are interested. So I do highly recommend actually sitting down with Dr. Carrier. I've told other Christians this: engage him on his blog, write out your ideas. Dr. Carrier is one of few scholars that will actually sit down with a kind of novice audience and engage in a discussion as long as it's respectful and we're not attacking each other. So definitely tell other Christians or others to come out and do that.
But I have to add the footnote to that is that I do it for a living.
Yes.
So I get this a lot. I get tons and tons of people say, puffing their chest and say, let's have a debate. It's like, no, I mean, are you going to fund it? So I appreciate the fact that you're willing to put the money behind it. And to me, that means a lot, because I run into, especially people who have tinfoil hat stuff. Like they'll be so adamant, like, why won't you debate this crazy, weird fringe theory or whatever? And I say, well, okay, so here's my rates, and they're totally reasonable rates. And they don't, if they're not willing to put that much money, that's really paltry amount of money to debate it, then it tells me that they don't really take seriously their own position, right? Because they don't really want to invest anything in this. So when people do want to invest things in it, I take that very seriously, because that communicates to me that like okay, yeah, you really want to see this happen. You really do back this. You're coming from a sincere position, and so that's valuable to me. And also, it's like I said, it's how I make a living. So I appreciate people bringing me work that as long as it's interesting. And your presentations are always interesting, even though I almost always totally disagree with you on things. They're at least valuably stated, well composed, and something that I can engage with on a serious basis rather than just some crazy rant, which you don't do crazy rants, which is great.
So yeah. real quick, guys, I put the article in the comments, right? At least I put the, I searched Jonathan Sheffield here, and there's like your debate response to him. Mm-hmm. And of course,
we've done other debates too. People who don't know, we've done a ton of others. But yeah, the first two pop up will be Jonathan's statement, and then the second will be my analysis. I mean,
there's a lot. You guys have talked a lot. I mean, that's a lot for your blog.
We did. We've done 2 other debates, I think, and those we went much longer. So like this was just 2 documents, his opening and my response, and then we came on here to discuss it like we're doing now, which is also a good format, which we've done before as well. But the other ones we extended the number of entries quite a lot. So some of them have like a total of 12 entries between the 2 of us, so like 6 and 6, which I find very valuable, because if you keep the word count low and then do a bunch of little ones, it keeps focus. So you don't have like these word walls that you're throwing at each other. You actually like have to be concise and get to right point. And then The depth comes from the number of entries. So I find that debate format has been the most productive of any that I've ever done.
Wow.
And so it's the format I want to extend. And I'm doing it now with the animal rights debate that I'm having about animal experimentation with a philosopher, Paul Bali, and that's happening now. And we're going to do 3 and 3. So we'll have 6 entries altogether with a much shorter word count. And so that's a format that I find very productive, actually.
Well, anyone could go click that link, and if you want to read it after, if you haven't already read it, that's something to work on looking into. We do have a question and a super chat. Of course, super chat your questions. I'd like to get some questions to our guests here, Dr. Richard Carrier and Jonathan Sheffield. And Gnostic Informant, my friend, please go subscribe to him, by the way. Thank you for the super chat. He says, question for Sheffield. Do you think that it's probable? And then he goes down and he says, or is it really, does it make sense? Should have said, do you think it makes sense, is what he said, that Alexander was told that he was going to die by the Jews, Daniel, and he was okay with this? I mean, imagine a battle leader, beast of a man, like being told your mortality is going to happen. Like, do you think it seems to make sense that would be something he'd be okay with or even listen to?
Can I briefly go to bat for Jonathan on this one?
Please, go to bat.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, so what I understand what they're getting at is if you can read these, there's the prophecy in Daniel 2, incidentally, and then there's a prophecy in Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is kind of like riffing on Daniel 2 in that respect, expanding on it a bit. Either one could be used to argue to Alexander that he's going to have a great empire, etc. My perspective, and I even mentioned this in my analysis, is that if that happened, it's on the presupposition that this hypothesis is true. Like, so let's say Daniel 1-6 was presented to Alexander in the 4th century, or even written, completely forged for the specific purpose of presenting to Alexander. When they did that, they would spin it as his is the great eternal empire that's mentioned at the end. But to their own people, they would say, actually, that's God's empire that's coming next, right? Because they did the same thing with Antiochus, right? They had this whole thing. They would sell it in a cryptic way so that it looks like you could fudge or interpret it as praise of Antiochus, but really it's a dig on Antiochus, right? So I think that would be plausible in context. I don't think that's what happened, but that's different. Like, probability and plausibility, it takes less evidence to get to plausible than it does to get to probable. So I don't think that's probably what happened, but it is plausibly what happened. So I think they could sell the prophecy in a way that wouldn't offend Alexander and would aggrandize him, essentially. So that's my take. I know that's supporting Jonathan's position a bit.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I guess from my standpoint, even if we given chapters 1-6, 7, 8, existed at that time, I do think these are largely prophecies that require a lot of interpretations. And I think the Jews at that period, I think if anything, seeing Alexander come down, along that coast, may have created discussions. And if they had chapter 8, where it sort of gives more of an interpretation of, this is going to be a Greek king that's going to take him down, they would still have to deal. It doesn't say Alexander's name, and the 4 kingdoms are kind of, prophetically intertwined in that. So how much they would have understood in terms of, this may be the guy that this scripture we have may be referring to. So there may have been an internal discussion. And as a ploy to secure the state of Judea and Jerusalem for the preceding generations, it does go to motive to use whatever you have, even though I think, drumming up a fake would have just been bad business, and probably rather not do it than do it, because I think that's mutually assured destruction. So I would say, either they didn't understand what it said, or maybe they had some ideas, but I think when they saw what Alexander was coming down, maybe there was an internal deliberation. Is this the guy that the document is referencing? Because it doesn't specifically say his name. So But I don't think he would tell them, yeah, by the way, this is only one aspect in God's design. You're going to be done soon. And then actually, you're only going to be living to 32. And by the way, it's not your descendants that are going to take over your kingdom. Your generals are going to divide it up amongst themselves. And then they're going to forget about your passion for India and Afghanistan. And they're going to focus on what they really wanted to in the very beginning, that whole coastline. So.
Interesting. Thank you for that super chat and you guys answering the question. Really appreciate that. So nobody else is throwing anything at us in terms of questions or super chats, but I'd like to ask.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
No, I was just going to mention me and Jonathan had a talk yesterday. We've been kind of chit-chatting about it. And we talk about scholars on chapters 1 through 6 in Daniel being potentially older Aramaic, if you will, or at least most of that being Aramaic. The question then, what Jonathan pointed out was, well, we have chapter 8, and chapter 8 is talking about this dividing of the kingdom and what's going on here. So maybe we can get into that and have you and him like take a focus on this, because you're willing to grant chapters 1 through 6, but there's no way in hell you're willing to go, all right, chapter 8 was also back then.
Yeah.
And we could get into that, but we do have a super chat. So whenever, if you want to respond to that, and then we can get into
I would say, well, just briefly on that, this does get discussed, I think, in the previous stuff.
Yes.
It didn't come up in this one exchange that we're talking about today, but in my previous analysis of the debate that Sheffield had with the other scholars, the Assyriologist and the biblical historian, I do mention this a little bit, but there is, for example, there's a chiasmus that gets constructed. You can show the way there's a sort of shell structure or onion structure in Daniel that crosses these two halves. But it doesn't exist in the first 6 chapters. So when the authors added the next 6 chapters, they actually found a way to create a chiasmus out of the previous material. So there's sometimes that chiasmus is argued as evidence that the two halves were original or were composed at the same time. But if you start from the hypothesis that they weren't, there is no chiasmus. But if you start from the hypothesis that they were, one gets constructed. So I think the issue of chapter 8, I think, is a product of the attempt to actually make a unity with chapters 1 to 6. I think this was an intentional design of the people who stitched them together, if that's what happened. I personally think it's slightly more probable that the entire thing was forged in the second century BC. But I give a healthier probability to it being the two halves theory, the 4th century and then the 2nd century. I just don't think that's the most probable, but I do assign it a respectable possibility. And you can explain the structure on either hypothesis. So that's why the structure does not argue for either hypothesis or against either hypothesis. It fits both, basically.
Okay. Did you want to comment on that before I pull the super chat up,
Jonathan? Oh, no, you can pull the super chat, because I know that was one of the older points that we had already gone over.
Yeah.
And Dr. Carey has written on this as well. So
okay. Yeah. Thank you, Endo, for the super chat. Endo says, Isaiah 44:45 prophesied a king of Persia named Cyrus who would allow Jews to return home from exile in Babylon, written 150 years before. Thoughts?
Yeah.
So, and you could either go first, Dr. Carrier, or mine to give your thoughts. Because I know this one's more.
I'll just one sentence my side of it, which is that the mainstream consensus is that Isaiah was written in multiple layers by different authors over a long period of time. So verses like that were added later. And there's a lot of evidence for this, but this isn't what our particular exchange was about, this specific thing. I throw a bibliography in, so people who want to look at the reasons why scholars come to these conclusions. And it's Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. So there's this whole structural theory of how Isaiah grew as a book over time. For people who are interested in that, there is a bibliography in my article, but that isn't something that I specifically went into in this particular debate, though.
Yeah, and I think my perspective is really discussing the political reality that pervades these situations. Now, as a person, I'm probably not the biggest fan of Carl Smith. He does have a lot of controversial views, especially against the Jews. But I do like the political theory of his friend and enemy distinction that the ruler would need to decide on in a state of exception. So you have the new kingdom, and one of the things I did point out in the article in reference to Cyrus is Dr. Carrier does give from what I thought at face value a very good explanation that hey, Cyrus wants to do it all. He doesn't want to cause any commotion. Hey, give everyone what they want back. Let everyone, operate independently and not try to come together and unite against me or reconstitute Babylon. My perspective on that, I was like, yeah, at face value, yeah, it makes sense. It's good policy across the board. I think my thought on the process is I started seeing all these other benefits. So obviously, just like we see with the Jews coming back to the area, there are reports from Ezra that the people of the area, because remember they moved out, and then you have a small minority of Jews because they were doing very well in Babylon. It's like, why am I going to leave all this wealth? And so they come back, and the problem I have with is not just the coming back, but I think it was more around you get to rebuild your structure where you get to be rebellious to the kings again, and now we're going to have to deal with that. And there was a lot in Ezra. It's reported that like the Samaritans, and you had some of the Babylonians, you had the Lebanese, a lot of people that were against this were like, hey, why do they get entitlement over this area? We're here. We want to participate. Religious freedom of all, but it looks like you're siding with this particular group. So, for me, what I'm trying to investigate is, okay, we have this claim, that, okay, it came in. And I think Josephus' report isn't that the Jews brought it to him, but Cyrus actually got wind of Isaiah. I think that's how it reads. So it wasn't, and then he calls a Jewish delegation before him just to get some more context. So, so for me, it wasn't just the allow home. It's, taking in that political theory of who's going to be your friends, who's going to be your enemies. And once again, we have this situation where, the Jews are the friends in this situation, which I thought was odd. Given, the Lebanese would be more important, or the Babylonians, or maybe even the Samaritans. So I'll definitely allow Dr. Carey to get his thoughts on there. Just from that
absolutely.
Political reality that I was trying to talk to.
Yeah, and political reality is what we got to look to, right? So the genius of the Cyrus strategy hinges on doing the exact opposite. It hinges on having basically division. He wants there to be division. He doesn't want to consolidate and grow the power of the Lebanese. He wants to break shit up. He wants a bunch of little satrapies, because then he can pit them against each other, and in exactly this way, right? So he does not want to kowtow to anyone who would make those arguments. And we don't have this comparable literature for other ethnic groups that this was happening to. So I would not doubt that this was the same kind of argument that was being heard all over the Persian Empire because of this decree. So what happens is, like, the Babylonians would invade, take people, loot their stuff, and then bring them into exile. Which means at that moment, you've got about 50 years of new stakeholders moving into these abandoned territories and trying to claim them. So by actually claiming that you're going to restore the ethnicities to their original lands and temples and stuff like that, you are actually stepping on the toes of a bunch of people who tried to exploit the gap. And that had to have happened all over the empire. We just don't have the literatures of these little other arguments that were going on. I'm sure everybody who was a stakeholder in this was bitching and moaning about his thing. But that's exactly indicative of his policy working, because that's what he wants. He doesn't want to, like, give in to these new stakeholders. He wants to shrink them. He wants to actually divide them and have much more different groups who all support him because they're all being granted this boon, right? So they aren't going to go against Cyrus when they're getting such this great benefit from him. It makes them kindly disposed to him, while at the same time splitting up. It's the Tower of Babel, dividing everybody even more, which makes it easier to rule. So the politics of it make complete sense and is quite clever. On top of that is the economic genius of it, is that what he's doing is with the Babylonians, we're basically looting and reducing the economic productivity of these regions, even of people, right? And so Cyrus comes in and says, no, look, I'm going to have big business investment in these enterprises, send tons of personnel back there, stoke these engines, get these engines running again, because he's going to skim off the top, right? So this is actually business investment. This is good business, is to restoke these power centers, or these economic power centers, so that he can get more tribute out of them. So it was a really clever thing, and he explicitly alludes to all of these points in his own decree. So it was a really good move, but it was clearly a move that was empire-wide. It wasn't focused on it. There's nothing particular about his doing this for the Jews. He did the same exact things for all these other ethnicities in his empire.
Thank you. Appreciate that, guys. I cannot pronounce your name, and it looks like it's in Arabic. Thank you for the super chat. Did not Alexander have horns in the Danielic text, like the Quran, Dil Karnan? I don't know if I'm saying that right. How do you pronounce that? The word. I think a lot of people are saying that this is actually Daniel in the Quran, the two-horned figure, or it's either Cyrus or Daniel, something like that. Are you aware of this?
This isn't the thing that I've focused on, so I really can't comment.
Okay. No, the only thing I think
there's imagery, there's horn imagery in Daniel, but it's all metaphor. So it's not claiming that Daniel showed up with actual horns. You know what I mean? So I think I don't understand the question, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure either. The only thing I think I've brought up in the past is, I believe in the Quran there's a sort of reference to Alexander and some wall, but I mean there's no other literature or any type of mention. So yeah, I'm not sure where this
That's
is
another
going.
thing I have not looked into, is references to Daniel in the Quran. Quranic studies is not my area, so I've only written some Muslim counter apologetics, but I'm not an expert in medieval Arabic or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm not the guy to ask. There are other experts who have studied Quranic literature and would know more about that.
Huh. Okay. Well, I appreciate the super chat. So technically, for that first answer, though, and it being written before, you would say, no, that was written after. That text was added.
I say later. That. Obviously, Jonathan says the very
He thinks it's prophetic, right?
Correct, yeah.
This boils down to what convinces. This is like a question to ask you, Jonathan. It's like, why assume that is written before? Like what? And this is more of an epistemological question, I guess, because I'm asking you, like, what makes you think this is true? Like, what actually makes you convinced? Like, if you ran to any other literature and you ran into their prophecies, let's just say, would you approach this the same way and go, actually the Chinese figured this out 300 years before they knew that this was going to happen, and sure enough it did, or whatever? Like, what convinces you to say, all right, this really is a prophecy, this is really true?
Yeah, so and one of the things I do want to bring up, because obviously there are epistemological differences between Dr. Carrier and and once again, this doesn't take anything away from Dr. Carrier at all, in the sense that he's a great historian. I ask him to get involved in these concepts because he provides great insights. Obviously, we have different worldviews. I do understand, as a member of the Anglican tradition, I'm already predisposed to, my Calvinistic worldviews, which speaks to some of the themes in the article. Obviously, I'm already predisposed to a non-Epicurean view of God. So, my views on the incarnation or God's active role in history isn't looking out there from an observer just while the wheels are spinning. So first, I do recognize my own influences growing up within the Anglican tradition. One thing I would say about the Anglican tradition, it does have a strong empirical tradition or legacy about it. When we look at Francis Bacon, when we look at Berkeley or Berkeley, hopefully I didn't pronounce that wrong. I know there's two different ways to say it.
Oh, the philosopher.
Yes.
I think it's
the
Barclay, but I'm not an expert in that literature, so
yeah, no,
I could be wrong.
But so there is, there is this school of thought. I mean, John Locke, is one of the great British empiricists. He was obviously influenced in his writings by Richard Hooker in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. So there is this strong tradition. And I know a lot of people ask me about, why do you, quote like William Winston? Well, he's part of, this empirical tradition that we're a part of. Yes, we do have our theological worldviews. Now, in particular to this, and it kind of goes into the background of why I chose some of the sources that I did. Which really goes to this problem that I struggle with, and when we talk about the Jews or trying to explain them. Now, in the article, I'm pinpointing certain junctures at history. I'm not saying this happens all the time, but I noticed that there was something different here for me. And so when I engage, people like Mark Twain, for me, what I liked about Mark Twain is, and anyone who's read Huckleberry Finn, is he's dealing with some real issues in that book. He's dealing with slavery and the perception from a southern boy, Huckleberry Finn, and this journey down the Mississippi River where Huckleberry Finn doesn't look at Jim as property anymore, but he starts to look at him as a human being. And for Mark Twain, who grew up in the South, who was part of the Confederacy for I think a couple of weeks. He's trying to get out those insights into the human condition. So he's grappling with big philosophies of his day. He kind of makes fun of the Romantic period at the end of it. So he's dealing with the philosophies of his day. I kind of look at him as, one of the good intellectuals after the Civil War. And I think he has done some good stuff for history in the sense that getting Ulysses S. Grant's works published, whether there was good reasons or bad reasons for it. I wasn't part of those conversations, but he talked him out of a deal. And those works are very important for historical analysis, since you have the guy who, basically won it for us. Well, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so that's why I always appeal to the North. But so for me, he recognized something about the Jews that I see in myself. That it's like, wow, this does seem strange. It doesn't mean there's natural design by some God that's orchestrating all these events, but he thought there was something weird. The same thing with Nikolai Berdyaev. He does come out of that period of the Russian Revolution. He was a serious Marxist, and he did adhere to the Vienna Circle and its principles. And he goes through a study where he himself has trouble. Now, does that resonate in the real world? Is there any logic to that? Maybe, maybe not. But he goes through some of the problems that I see in trying to explain these events. And that's to saying I default naturally to a God hypothesis. But I do want to investigate it. And when I look at these series of events, or what maybe I see as statistical anomalies, is, it leads me back to my conclusion. Now, whether that's right, whether part of it is my Anglican background, being predisposed to I mean, Gary can tell you the Calvinistic worldview, and maybe Derek too, is all about predestination, God's natural providence. It ties into this whole argument. So I am aware of my views on the incarnation or God's act role in history, but it is tough for me. And I know this conversation came up in Dr. Carrier's blog, where I look at passages from Isaiah, and it's hard for me, whatever that reason is, that I don't look at 1948 and tie that back. I'm like, man, now, am I gullible? Am I seeing, is this a mirage? It's fun.
This is a great point, because I want to. We have a question in the form of a super chat. I'm taking super chats if you want to ask a question.
But I do want Dr. Carrier to respond to it. But I want to give him my background, because you know, just like I select Mark Twain, Berdyaev. Now, Dr. Carrier in his writings, I tell everyone to look at his writings. Dr. Carrier has big ideas like this too, as he's really able to explain what's happening in history. And I find this in his articles, and that's why I'm impressed and want to engage, because the same interaction I get with a Twain or a Berdyaev, even from a different perspective, their insights into the human condition, or in Dr. Carrier's case, you know, the history, the politics, and everything that's going on. I think Dr. Carrier's made some great strides. And I say that having spoke with Dr. Ehrman and other thinkers in his pool, but I think Dr. Carrier brings something a little bit more to the table, which is why I engage him in these discussions.
Well, dude, thank you so much. You know that I had to let you say what you had to say, and I just wanted to flip the question around without making it, so to speak, directly critical of you or what you think. But Dr. Carrier, why don't you accept that Isaiah was written, or this particular thing was written 150 years before it actually is supposedly happening? Because just to get two different epistemologies here, you can see how one is saying, here's why I don't accept that, and vice versa.
For people who want to dive into that, like I said, there's a bibliography on this that I put into my article in this. And I mean, there's stylistic, structural, and historical reasoning as to how Isaiah is argued to be a multi-century document, in much in the way that Homer is, for example, using a lot of the similar points. So I won't go too far into that. If people want to go into that, they can go research why people believe in Deutero-Isaiah and not just Isaiah. So that's a pretty mainstream view. But I want to touch on what Sheffield was talking about. People might not know why he mentioned Twain and Berdyaev right just now, if you haven't read the articles. And one of the reasons was, like, one of the points I made is, like, you can't cite these as authorities because they're not historians and they predate modern historical methodology, or I should say contemporary historical methodology. And what Sheffield's talking about there is, I want to make a distinction between historiography and history. So historiography is the history of an idea. So, like, you could talk about this hypothesis about the Jews, that there's something special or exceptional about them, that they're unusually blessed or whatever. But you can cite Berdyaev and Twain and Smith, for example, as historical examples of this idea. But you can't cite them as authorities on it being historically correct, because none of them are qualified to actually comment on that. But Twain is brilliant. You know, he's a brilliant author, brilliant wit, brilliant political commentator. But he was not a trained historian. And even if he was, the methods of history, even in the late 19th century, were pretty much garbage. They were terrible. There was a huge shift in methodology, making history more scientific in the early 20th century that really, like, one of the main dividing points is around 1950. It's like after 1950, things got much more sophisticated than had been before. And so now anything before 1950 needs to be re-vetted by the new methodologies. So that was the reason why I pointed that out. There's nothing wrong with citing, like, the history of your own idea, but that doesn't support the truth of your idea. So that's why I don't find that as a useful thing. You could say, well, you know, other people have noticed this, but here's what I'm noticing, and that would be enough, really. You can't really cite the authorities, or you can't cite Twain and Berdyaev and Smith as authorities on this. They really aren't. They have ideas, but whether those ideas are valid or not is a completely different thing. With regard to blessedness, I mean, if we're going to, like, pick people that way, if we're going to say, well, who does it seem has had the greatest blessing of the gods, and you'd have a hard time arguing for anyone beating out India or China. These are the two longest standing nations in history, with the religions as the oldest on earth. And so, you know, no one's ever conquered or broken up China. No one's ever conquered. Lots of people have tried. Same with India. Tons of invasions, but here it is, still there, India. Now, I don't believe this. I don't think there's any divine intervention explaining the miraculous invulnerability of India and China. I think I can explain this structurally with ordinary natural causes. And I can do the same with the history of the Jews too. So I think that's why I don't buy into like this miraculous narrative. I think we can explain it in ordinary historical terms, and there's nothing miraculous in you pick any particular sequence of events in the history of the Jews, and you can see why things happen the way they did. There's no point where you can say, oh, God must have intervened to change this. There isn't. Like you can explain the whole thing with no God intervention whatsoever, and so that's why I don't buy into that particular narrative. I also, of course, I argue that it's a non sequitur. Even if it were true, it doesn't mean that the Jewish authors like Josephus never told us a fib. That's
interesting. Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. Scott Turf, thank you for the super chat. I forget which group is which in the first century. Pharisees, Sadducees. Can you rename them like Seinfeld in the garage scene? Your mother is I haven't seen it, but it sounds like it's heading in
too long ago. I can't remember how that scene plays out. So I'm sure I've seen it. It's just I've not revisited it. So no, I can't go to the Seinfeld point. But it depends on what you want to know. Like, what do you want to know about the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Also, we're not entirely confident we know as much as we think we know, because a lot of our information comes from Josephus, and he's not the best organizer of facts on these things. So in short, though, the Pharisees were predominantly the rabbinate. So like that became basically the authors of the Talmud later, that sort of evolved into the rabbinical Judaism. And the Pharisees were divided amongst many sects, but the two leading sects were the Shammaites and the Hillelites, were the conservatives and the liberals correspondingly. The liberals won out eventually, but you still see some of the conservative opinions get added as footnotes. Kind of like Supreme Court dissents, you have the Supreme Court decision, and then you have the one judge who says, no, fuck you, and has his own thing. So we have that. We have the Talmud is mostly recording the Hillelite view, and then you'll see a Shammai view just tacked on at the end. And then these jokers say this instead. So that's the way we break down the Pharisees. They're much more the preservers of the oral law. These are the Mishnah people, basically. The Sadducees seem to have been more into the religion rather than the law. So as far as, and Josephus contradicts himself on this. So sometimes he's saying the Sadducees are the most brutal enforcers of the law, and other times he's saying that they were less interested in it. So it's hard to really nail that down. But the Sadducees, Josephus portrays as being similar to Epicureans. They had like a realpolitik interpretation of God. So he's kind of accusing them of being atheists in a way. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They thought that was metaphor for they were realists, and that they thought the resurrection talk was all metaphor for the resumption of the supremacy of Israel as a nation. So the Sadducees were more looking at resurrection as resurrection of Israel rather than the resurrection of actual individual people after they die. And so there's various other like views of this. And you see this in the Book of Acts, right? Like the Book of Acts shows Paul pitting the Pharisees against the Sadducees on this, and you see this in the Gospels as well. Jesus has to deal with this sort of argument over, is there a resurrection or not? And the Sadducees have all their polemics about why the resurrection is a ridiculous idea. And so you see Jesus interact with that in there. So the Sadducees were predominantly associated with the priesthood. So they were more in charge of the temple than the Pharisees were, interestingly enough. So that's that. I mean, that's the best I can sketch. There's other like minor details about these. I have a breakdown of all the known sects. They're up to 32 actually. Or at least up to 30, definitely at least 10, and possibly as many as 30 sects of Judaism before the Jewish War. And I have them all laid out with footnotes, with scholarship on each one, if you want to go into depth on these. And that's in the book, The Empty Tomb. So in the book, The Empty Tomb, it was edited by Robert Price and Jeff Lauder. It has a bunch of chapters by a bunch of authors. It has 3 chapters by me that still hold up pretty well on different theories of explaining the resurrection story. And one of them I go into the different views of resurrection. So when I talk about the spiritual body of Christ, what did that mean? And to do that, I go into the background of Jewish diversity, explaining like there was a lot of disagreement among the Jews on a lot of things, a lot of sectarian division. And so I created kind of like a canned encyclopedia of them, basically. So I do have a few sentences on each, and then if you want, and then sources. So if you want to go into more detail on what we know about these sects, most of them we know almost nothing about. We just know that they disagreed with everybody else, but not on what or in what way. But some of them we can reconstruct more detail. And so that's if people are interested in that, that's the book to get. There's a lot of other valuable material in it as well. So it's worthwhile in general.
Interesting. Did you want to just move to the next super chat here, Jonathan? Or
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Carey explained that well. I had pointed out two main groups because that's where a lot of the infighting was about, especially with Paul, who represented one of the particular groups. But yeah, we could move on to the next. Your mother is it's hilarious.
I kind of want to know where that phrase is. I want to hear it. Hey, Indo, thank you for the super chat. He says, you better put the smackdown on CC tomorrow, Richard.
Canadian Catholic is what they're referring to.
Yeah.
Yes, I will be live on Canadian Catholic show. It'll be short. He's only paid for 40 minutes, so that's all we're going to do. We'll see what happens. He's a bit of a character, so who knows? It might be a waste of time. It might be interesting. I have no idea. We're going to go toe-to-toe on the history of the City of Jesus. We'll see what happens there.
In 40 minutes.
Yeah. Good luck. You guys will barely scratch the surface unless he goes straight in. I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting. I know that much. He doesn't like me at all now. I just went on Nathan's channel one day. Anyway, we'll spare that. This is your guys' time. That's why we're doing this. So anyway, Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. When you die, you're dead forever?
Well, that's what Josephus says, right? We actually don't have any writings from Sadducees. So we're kind of like, and what we have is we have Josephus, and then we have the Talmud, which rags on Sadducees constantly. And so we have stuff from the Pharisees who hated the Sadducees, and we have Josephus, who I think was a Pharisee. He studied under them all, he claims, and then settled on Phariseeism. So anyway, that's what our sources say. And if we understand this in context, what it would have been is that they probably were annihilationists. They probably thought that people don't live forever, but the people live forever, right? Is there? So they were more like real worldists, this worldists in that sense. Now it's entirely possible the Sadducees also did believe in a disembodied afterlife, a heaven like other people did, but all the sources, the Talmud and Josephus, claim they didn't. Claim they're very much against an afterlife belief. It would be interesting to actually have a treatise from them to see how they conceptualized it, because this is actually highly unusual in the ancient world to find. You find the rationalists, right? The Greek rationalists, even they were divided on whether you survive death. But the hardcore ones were usually atheists. So the question is, here's Sadducees who are hardcore religionists, not buying into an afterlife belief of any kind. That's really rare in the history of religions. So that's why I'm not sure if we're being told the truth about what the Sadducees taught. But I don't know. We don't have any writings from them. So all we can go on is what we're told.
Interesting. Any comment, Jonathan?
No, it comes down to the same point. We don't have their actual commentary on these particular ideas. So, I mean, one of the big groups were, you have all these little debates on how you were washing your hands. So there's a lot of minutia in that, because in the Gospels, some of that comes in there about, not washing the hands. Well, no, both Jews wash their hands. So from a Jewish perspective in the Gospels, they're not talking about, they're not washing their hands. It's a particular way about you doing it. It's almost like how the Roman Catholics signed the cross versus the Greek Orthodox. It's one of those minutiae in there. So when you read in the Gospels about, why aren't they washing their hands? Why aren't you washing it according to this prescribed way that we do? So that's where I think it goes back to Dr. Carey's point. Without really understanding their commentary on this, is this one of the minutiae that they drew out of that conversation? Oh, they just don't believe in a resurrection. So,
Thank you, Kristen. What is up? She says, if you're saving 10% on your income by switching to atheism, support MythVision. Look, I've got theists, by the way, who support MythVision, who are there, who help support, and one of them's on the channel right now.
Yeah, once again, I've shared views with a lot of people. I'm not big on the whole gifting and tithes. I think it's a modern day version of indulgences that are being pushed within the evangelical community. I do like to support good causes. You know, I just had to buy my son some video games for PS5. So just because you know, a Christian doesn't mean I can't support other secular activities. But you know, Derek once again does really great work. You know, on putting together stuff. So I'm supporting the person. You know, with Dr. Carey, he does really great work on these projects I engage him with. So that's where I find value. Sometimes I don't find value in giving to a building fund, you know, especially one that I'm not living in since I got to pay rent. So that's some of my views on the gifts and tithing. I do think it's a modern day indulgences that are being spread. Except, even though they're promoting all these benefits, I only see one party getting the benefit. So I haven't got my private plane yet. So
Right. Yeah.
that's where I use my money for other things as part of my my ministry. So engaging with other philosophers and historians can be better use than given to someone's building
Yeah, you
fund.
know, that's actually a really good point. To reflect on that from the other side, right? So I'm not a big fan of live debates, like in studio, in stage debates. I do them. I'm good at them. I never organize them. If someone wants to hire me to do one, I will do one. And there's tons of examples on YouTube. You can go find me in a million debates on this stuff, because I find them mostly gamesmanship, mostly rhetoric. They're not really they don't really get substantive. But one value of them is that for example, my debate with William Lane Craig, when else am I going to fill a room with 1,000 Christians who will listen to me for 2 hours, right? And similar to the debate I had with Hassanein Rajabali, it was me and Dan Barker and Rajabali and Michael Corey, which Hassanein Rajabali is a Muslim apologist. So we filled literally an audience of 1,000 Muslims. Like when is that ever going to happen other than a debate? Now, yes, they're trying to knock down my ideas, and you know, Hassanein Rajabali did the whole fire and brimstone kind of preacher thing, angry preacher routine on stage. But nonetheless, all my ideas got heard, right? So that I think I'm reaching an audience that I wouldn't normally reach. So that is better than preaching to the choir in a way, right? And so Sheffield, what he's saying is the exact same thing, is that if you're just Christians talking to each other, all you're doing is reinforcing the faith that you already have. You're not evangelizing. And usually when evangelists, like missionaries, they want to control the narrative. They don't want to let the other side have their say or take or whatever. And so that limits the ways they can evangelize, and in ways that I think are undermining of their goal. So if they have an actual, like, a good thing, they have a good product to market, supporting and getting into the interfaith dialogue actually is the way to do it, because you're going to get audiences that wouldn't pay attention to you otherwise. And then it's just a question of, do your ideas hold up, right? So like that's what I think is actually the best way to proceed.
As Jonathan would say, your ideas.
That's the intrusive R from growing up in Brooklyn, New York. So just to let everyone know.
I had to do it.
All right, yeah.
He's my buddy. I always sometimes he'll pronounce things Josephus, and I'm like, Josephus. But you know, I gotta love the guy. We got a couple more super chats. I'm sorry.
No,
it's all right.
Constellation Pegasus says, seems early Judaism was fractured from the top to bottom, like Christianity today. It's been fractured from the top to bottom from the very beginning. Would you like to comment on that? Maybe start with Jonathan and then Carrier?
Yeah, I know from the perspective, you know, Christianity was very divided, from the very beginning. I think we see this in the literature very early on about, you know, just when are we going to observe the date of Easter? And, you know, out in Asia Minor and in over in the West with Rome, there was a big diversion of that. When you look at our liturgical calendars, I know Constantine was trying to set up something that was more uniform throughout Christianity. You know, we don't even have that the liturgical sense. You know, different communities and churches, you know, were setting up something that was the same idea, but a little different. obviously the Arians coming in, and you have all these different groups, just like the Protestants are today. I mean, you have a conversation with 3 Protestants, you get what, 5 groups out of it. So it has been very sectionalized, and I think, for me, this goes back from the very beginning. The Church of Alexandria was always fighting with Rome. We see this in Asia Minor from some of the disputes coming out there. North Africa, another epicenter of Christianity. You see these big debates with Rome. You see it in Alexandria. You see it at Antioch. Bishops are being deposed of. You have the Arian group comes on scene, and Constantine, and it seems like Eusebius is secretly supporting them. So there's always been infighting. There's always been diverse opinions. Just like with Judaism, you see that same sectarian breakout throughout Christian history. Now, we're united, I guess, with the scriptures in some regards, since Roman Catholics or the Ethiopian Church may have fewer more or less than others. So there is some binding consensus on some of the creeds. Obviously, after the Reformation, it just went out the door, and I think this was the fear that you open up to some of these ideas, and all of a sudden now you have 3,000 different groups, if not more. So yes, it is that by design? Is that better? So you have no controlling interest So you look at the political ramifications for them. Better to be independent and not having a universal pope or a universal bishop overseeing, because what comes out of that? So I think there is some benefit, whether that's by design or just you have all these competing ideas and no one's ever going to go along. But yes, we've seen that throughout Christian history.
So we got 3 more super chats after this question-wise. But Dr. Carey, would you like to address this? Judaism fractured from top to bottom?
Yeah, it's interesting. Ironically, Judaism became less fractured over time. Before the Jewish War, it was hugely fractured, way more than the Gospels represent. After the Jewish War, there was more consolidation. There was kind of like the selection event that really selected out a lot of movements. So Judaism, it has a lot of very small fringe outbreak sects, right? But since then, but the majority of Judaism is really 2 sects now, which is Orthodox and Reform. And Reform Judaism is a really big tent view, so it's inclusive of a lot of diversity. And so that because of that, they don't expel people for having quote unquote unorthodox views within Reform Judaism. It's really a big tent sect, right? So there's a lot of diversity among Reform Jews, up to and including cultural Judaism, right? Which are the atheists who still practice Judaism and practice Judaism maybe even at various degrees. Like some eat kosher and some don't, right? So it's and yet still go to synagogue, still participate in the Jewish community, might still celebrate certain holidays and things. So, but that's all considered Reform Judaism, and they aren't fractured in that sense, because they don't require anyone to adhere to a certain set of doctrines to be in. So it's more of a community than a sect in that sense. The Orthodox, they're super hardcore. They will expel you if you don't follow things a certain way, and they do. There are splinter sects of them where they disagree, but there is a lot of unity amongst the Orthodox sects. So Judaism has kind of just sort of settled down into the conservative Shemaites, and the even more liberal than the Hillelites is what we've ended up with within Judaism. And I think the reason that is because Reform Judaism, which is the most populous, most Jews by far worldwide are in the Reform tradition, is so inclusive, and because they don't require you to leave if you disagree with certain things. They've never fractured because there's nothing to fracture over, really.
Wow, well put. Thank you, guys. Crossover Maniac, thank you for the super chat. Didn't the Sadducees only acknowledge the Torah as canon and not the books of the prophets? And was a lack of any mention of an afterlife in the Torah the reason why they didn't believe in resurrection? We'll start with Carrier, working to Jonathan.
Okay.
I don't know that we know the answer to that, actually. Of course, the Torah does not have any explicit mention of an afterlife. by which we mean the Pentateuch, right? So you get the first mentions of that in the other literature, the king's literature, books of Samuel and things like that. You start to see hints of afterlife. Even then, it's not clear. Like the Witch of Endor summons the spirit to talk, but it's not clear that spirit was doing anything other than sleeping. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like, it's not clear that there's some sort of afterlife he's living in, but the spirit the spirit of the dead can be woken up from the grave and you can talk to it, which was a common necromantic principle in the ancient Near East. We find tons of spells and other versions of magic where you could do this, or you could even keep the skull of someone and talk to their soul from time to time. You just have to wake it up. But in that view, there is no afterlife per se, because people just sleep. And then if you wake them, their spirit shows up where you are. There's not like a hell or a heaven where they're located. Trying to relocate the souls into paradises or hells and so forth was an influence from outside. A lot of other A&E cultures had that idea, and that started infiltrating into Judaism. So it's not implausible that the Sadducees took that position, and also whether they supported the additional literature or which literature. That's the other thing. We don't know their canon. We don't know their preferred selection of stuff. So there might be some references in the literature to them accepting only Torah. That's possible. I haven't double checked that. But then that runs into the question of, is that source reliable on this point? I guess I'm saying that we don't really know the answer to that question confidently.
Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I think it comes down to, what documentation we have that provide a specific list of, it's one thing to be more, I'm more predisposed to the to the Torah than the prophets and some of the histories. So we can't define a specific, genre of books that they were willing to accept, or were they just more predisposed to the Torah? And I think that's where I land on it as well. We don't have anything specifically stated. If I'm naturally assuming, I think they would acknowledge the writings, whether they were more predisposed to the Torah. That's a different question.
Thank you. Constellation Pegasus. The lack of detail of life after death in Judaism is truly bizarre. A basic thing to know, deafened by silence. I just don't understand why that is. I feel you. When I came from the Christian background, of course, it's like you kind of go, well, wouldn't this already be talked about thoroughly throughout the Hebrew Bible? But that's kind of what I feel where you're coming from. Would you guys like to make a quick remark? We'll get to the next super chat.
I do like Dr. Carrier's Witch of Endor, because it does open up the idea, at least, that they're trying to communicate with the afterlife, and is that another dimension? Right. And is it arising from a slumber or a sleep? Because it comes back and says, well, you shouldn't have done this. And what does that represent in Judaic culture? Obviously, from a Christian, we have our perspective and our interpretations of what's being portrayed there in the Old Testament. But
yeah,
it is quite interesting. I mean, there's passages of the people waiting. So it does make up a very good conversation. I do think it does remind me of the whole Yeshurian lake, or waiting, or I get the whole purgatory theme, that all these souls are just waiting for their people to forgive them as they're passing by, and to throw them up, please save us. But
yeah, it's worth pointing out that there's a lot more about discussions of the afterlife outside the Bible. So the Jewish Apocrypha, the historians, and so on, and the Talmud, right? So there you can find a lot of this stuff. It's just not in the canon, or what's called the canon now. There is some, obviously, but I think the main reason, I think there's two reasons. One is because they got so invested in resurrection theology. By the time you see Daniel, for instance, and the way Ezekiel was reinterpreted and so on, it mostly just stuck with that. So there wasn't much need to go into any further details. Like, oh yeah, we'll rise from the dead and God will fix everything. It'll be paradise, yada, yada. Don't need details. Whereas I think an additional factor of that is Merkaba mysticism was very big on keeping secrets. And so a lot of this stuff often got thrown under the table of these are secrets that only insiders should know. And so we're not going to write about them. So there's a lot of that idea that there might've been a lot more thinking about the afterlife than ends up in written texts. And we have hints of that even in early Christianity. So like the Ignatian letters mentions that there's some complex angelology that their religion depends on. And the author specifically says, well, I can't go into this because these are secrets that I'm not supposed to write down. And so we know there's a lot of secret teachings. And I think the afterlife doctrines were part of those secret teachings. And so that's why we don't see it written down a lot. And there's an analogy to this. The actual Bacchic mysteries, for example, also did this. The information about the afterlife is supposed to be restricted to initiates, and often initiates of a certain rank. And that's why when we dug up the graves of a lot of like 4th and 5th century Bacchic initiates, they were buried with these folded gold tablets, and sometimes lead, but usually gold, that had secret instructions about what to do when you get to the afterlife, and it had more description of what's there, what passwords to give to the gatekeepers, and all of that. It had a lot of detail that was clearly meant to be a mystery that only the people buried are supposed to know. We don't have that stuff anywhere else, right? So it only shows up in these secret documents buried in the graves. And so this idea of keeping some of the afterlife secret, it was a thing at the time. It wasn't just a Jewish thing at the time. But we also know from Merkaba, mysticism was also like this, that there was a lot of secret keeping. You see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of reference to things they can't write down. And so that's another reason I think we have less, speculation and talk about the afterlife than we have, for example, in the Greek and Roman literature.
All right, go ahead and use the restroom. I know you got to use the restroom real quick.
I'll be right back, guys.
The next super chat. I can
still hear what you're talking about. So
yeah, you're fine. You're fine. I'll do this right here. Go ahead and bounce them off the screen for a second. I just want to say, I think it's really funny that this is just me talking here, right? I think it's really funny that people who are alive have all the instructions on how to do things when you're not alive. But it's like, that's the kind of funny thing that I get is like, here's the instructions. All right, when you get to this gate, you're going to find this gate once you're dead. When you get to that gate, make sure you take a left and say the angel's name. It reminds me of that movie, Army of Darkness.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, he had to remember 3 words. That's it.
Yeah.
And it's Shadrach. I'm just using like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because that's such an easy 3.
Yeah, no, was it Abdu?
Narata,
yeah. It was.
The grave starts shaking, and the zombies come back to life, and he's like, "I said your words."
That's one of my favorite movies. He's like, "Give me some sugar, baby."
Give me some sugar, dude. That is such a classic.
He was like, "That was just pillow talk."
Yeah.
That's
Say hello to my boomstick.
Yes.
Yeah, that was definitely a classic. Richard will be back here in just a minute, everybody. The next one is going to be my friend Eric in Peru. He's got a nice super chat. I'm interested to hear his take. And, of course, your take as well. I'm enjoying this. How are you enjoying this, Jonathan?
No, it's great. It's really good discussion.
Awesome. I appreciate it, man. Thank you. You're the reason that this happened, making this happen. And, it's always fun hanging out, chatting with you and Richard. But yeah, make sure you have those 3 words right when you enter the afterworld. If you don't, just watch Army of Darkness. Yep. There's 3 stupid words. All right, just a moment longer here. Is there anything you'd like to make a comment about before Richard comes back and we hit the super chat?
No, once again, I really enjoy your channel. As Derek mentioned, I do support Derek's channel. I think this is part of my ministry and the interfaith dialogue. Derek does some really great content. Whether you agree with it or you do not agree with it, the level of engagement and support he provides is definitely a reason to go ahead and support his channel. I mean, how many people buy a Starbucks every day for like $2-3, and you can't do that once a month?
2 or 3. I wish it was 2 or 3.
Yeah, no, it's like $6 or $7.
Yeah. Yeah, it's expensive. But yeah, no, I totally appreciate that. And I know not everybody can too. That's another thing. Like they've got other things that on a different importance in their life, and I respect that too. Yeah, I'm looking forward to his super chat. We've got on Daniel 12:12, and then we also have. Let me look here. These super chats fly. Okay, Flip Flapsky. What an awesome name. Scholarvid, and then Ahmed. Hope I'm saying that right. So we'll get to you guys here in a moment. Just a moment longer. He's back. All right, switching sides again, back to Norm. You're there, man. You are there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. And in fact, I have a thing to add to what you were talking about earlier. Army of Darkness, Army of the Dead. What was the net movie?
Yeah,
Army of Darkness. We're trying to remember the three words that
I know exactly, and the words are very, very particularly interesting to this discussion. It's Klaatu Verata Niktu.
Oh, perfect.
You would so keep the army dead.
Which is the words that I can't remember the character's name. She was supposed to speak to Gort when Klaatu was killed in The Day the Earth Stood Still. It's supposed to mean in an alien language, resurrect Klaatu.
Huh.
So it's actually the phrase actually refers to resurrection, and you're talking about it in the context of afterlife. I thought that was a funny irony. and the fact that they chose those words for that movie is an inside joke about classic sci-fi. So
wow. Okay, super chats. My friend Eric in Peru. He says, "Hi, bro." For Richard, in Daniel 12:12 says, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1335 days." What's supposed to happen in 1335 days? In difference with the time, times, and half of time.
Yeah, there's a lot of ink has been spilled on trying to figure out exactly what that means. Just like everything in Daniel, it gets reinterpreted different ways by different people. So there's a different question between what the authors meant and then what everybody else later tried to interpret it to mean. I think what the authors meant was that's when the angel Michael will descend and kill all the enemies of the Jews and institute God's paradise. And so happy will be the one who gets to live to see that day, even though everyone who's righteous will get resurrected anyway. But it would be better to live rather than to have to suffer through the pangs of the grave between, now and then. I think is the general idea of what they were going for. What specific chronology they were trying to build and why and stuff like that might not be knowable. There might have been other particular reasons they were choosing the numerology they did.
So technically, to answer your question on what was supposed to happen, it was supposed to be a resurrection and a complete annihilation of
all of Israel. Yeah. And there's debate as to whether Daniel, what kind of paradise Daniel is discussing is going to come. Because we have references into some of the other prophets about the entire universe is going to be melted, and then there's going to be a new earth that's going to come down, and everybody's going to occupy that. And in fact, that in the Talmud, we all grow wings in the resurrection, specifically because there's going to be no earth; it's going to be destroyed. So we need to fly to get to the new paradise, right? So there's a lot of elaborate theology there, but what's in Daniel is much more obscure as to what they were thinking is going to happen. And since there's such diversity, we can't make assumptions as to what they thought.
Thank you. Flip Flopsky, thank you for the big super chat, my friend. Thank you so much. The New Testament was written in the 2nd century and stole characters from Josephus like Jesus and John the Baptist.
Stole Jesus from Josephus. I'm not sure that's a reference to.
I would have thought they would have said something that Luke was cribbing from Plutarch or.
The only thing this is incorrect in my opinion as a general statement. For example, Mark talks about Mark might have gotten ideas about John the Baptist and Jesus ben Ananias, which is probably what they're referring to. From Josephus's Jewish War, which is different from the Antiquities, one must keep in mind. And I don't know if John the Baptist is even in the Jewish War. I think he's in the Antiquities. But anyway, with the Jesus ben Ananias, it's not that Mark got the idea of Jesus from Josephus. The idea of Jesus predates Mark by decades, right? It's in Paul, for instance. So, but he's using this template of Jesus ben Ananias, who is this other prophetic figure who was killed during the Jewish war, and he uses the skeleton of his story to structure the story of the gospel Jesus. And so there's been some scholarship on this showing the analysis is like 20 to 22 points of comparison that are all in the correct order of how Mark is basically using a template from a different Jesus to tell the story of his Jesus. If people are interested in that, I have a whole section on it with bibliography on the history of the city of Jesus, which is my book on this, my peer-reviewed monograph on that. So that's in there if you're interested. The John the Baptist thing, I don't know to what extent. So the version of John the Baptist that we find in Josephus does not line up with the John the Baptist in the Gospels. So if there's borrowing in that direction, it's with alteration of some kind. But we do know that Luke Acts, there's a lot of evidence that Luke Acts knew the antiquities of Josephus and used it extensively for color context. But there's not a lot in Luke about John the Baptist that doesn't come from Matthew and Mark, right? So I wouldn't think that Josephus was a source that Luke necessarily used for John the Baptist. He may have gotten some of his little changes and stuff from there. I'm not sure. I've not looked into that critical analysis. There probably is some literature on it, but so I think one has to be more qualified than this sort of general statement that we've got from Flowsky.
Do you want to comment on that, or you agree, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, I think just the thoughts on, okay, well, if it was, if what he's referring to, which congregation did that come out with, and obviously there's different ideas. So in the 2nd century, when where were they pulling from, which church were they doing and how were they distributing it to other groups that we already know that are very decisive. So, but once again, I don't want to read too much into that because I'm trying to understand the basis of the claim. But no, I think what Carrier says makes sense.
Thank you. Scholar Vid, thank you for the super chat. He says, Jonathan, would you accept the ascension of Isaiah as evidence for the idea of a purely celestial Jesus? Would you accept that idea?
Well, the ascension of Isaiah, it's, one of my points is it's not found in the Orthodox Jewish canon or what they constitute that. I think the idea is that, yeah, that's you go to New York City, that's how we all talk.
I'm just teasing you, man.
No, it's all good. Even though I'm kind of down here in Texas, still has not lost it. But I think I would need probably a little bit more. I think, would I accept the ascension? I think Marcion makes a better claim for a purely celestial Jesus. I think, because I think the foundation of his argument is better from the ascension. Yeah, even though the idea is there, I think what Marcion is at least saying that this is the corpus of Paul, or the better understanding, and this is how we get this idea of Jesus. And I don't know Dr. Carrier's thoughts on that. I think I'm going to make a better argument for Marcion's overall view, because he was arguing, hey, this came first, all this stuff was added on, and the original idea of Jesus being this celestial Jesus is found within that context. So that's where I would say, not that it's evidence, yes. Better evidence, I think some of the claims that Marcion made has a stronger foundation within the church structure as a whole.
I think what Scholar Vid meant is a Jesus who never came to earth. I think that's what he's referring to, because this is the dispute over what did the original text of the Ascension of Isaiah say. Because we know what we have is not what was original, and so I discussed the complexity of this. What has been deleted? What has been added? What and so on. We can kind of attempt a reconstruction of an earlier version of the text, given all the different versions that we have, using the science of paleography and textual criticism. And I cover that in a chapter beginning of chapter 3 and on the historicity of Jesus. And I build out there the argument there that one could argue that it does, right? It does suggest that Jesus never came to earth in the original version, which we don't have. Now, it's worth pointing out that I give a weight to that as evidenced of almost 0 because of the ambiguities and uncertainties involved. We can't reliably date the document. We can't reliably reconstruct it with confidence and so on. So I think people like flip out when I start the chapter with that as a proof of concept of how this actually looks like it makes sense. Even though in the final analysis, I don't weight it very strongly. I don't think it's very strong evidence. It is evidence, like it weighs slightly in favor of that conclusion, but it is not the conclusive smoking gun that we would want. What we would want would be like pre-Paul, like if there was a document that predated Paul that said, essentially what we imagine that was said in the original. If there was an original copy of Ascension of Isaiah that predated Paul, and we could prove that. Like that would be extremely strong. That would be much stronger evidence, right? And it would be even stronger if it be dated as a Christian document to like the time of Mark, for example, when let's say the 70s AD, because then that would mean the Christians very early on, there were Christians unlike Mark taking a completely different tack on how to write the gospel of Jesus. But we don't have that. So like we would want that, but we don't have that. So as it is, it's so ambiguous, so meddled with. So none of the questions can be settled with confidence that it is weak evidence, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, gentlemen. Ahmed, I hope I'm saying that right. Ahmed, just saying thanks. You guys are fantastic. Learned so much from this channel and its community. Thank you all. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. Yeah. Would you guys like to do a 10-minute diatribe about this? No, I'm just kidding.
I do learn a lot. I know. I think this channel is great. Especially lately, you've been getting a lot of really cool scholars on, and of both genders too, which I really like. This not a lot of shows that focus on biblical studies will get some of the leading lights among the women who are scholars in this field too. So a lot of cool stuff on this channel. Check out.
Thank you. Constellation Pegasus. I hope I didn't skip anybody. I didn't see any other ones. So this is last one. Any books on these secret knowledge scrolls that people were buried with? Should we start digging up more graves? This is fantastic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they're called the gold tablets. There is literature on it. I mean, it's so old now. Like this is a footnote in the historical field. I mean, it's so old school that like everybody just knows it who's in the field of ancient religions, that there hasn't been much new written about it. So some of the writings about it are kind of hard to find actually nowadays. But it's all cited on the history of Jesus. No, in the Empty Tomb. I discuss it in the Empty Tomb. So that's another example of something where I think, yeah, that's right. Because I analyze Mark's Empty Tomb story in light of these secret gold scrolls. Because what they say, there's a lot of interesting riffs. So it almost looks like Mark knows the mystery teaching of the Bacchae and is creating a better, newer version of it involving Jesus. I mean, it's not decisive, but it's tantalizing. It's like the Ascension of Isaiah in that way. It's tantalizing, but it doesn't conclusively prove anything. But the point being is I have a footnote in there that cites the literature. It's mostly journal articles. I don't know if there might be a book on it. I can't remember now off the top of my head, but yeah, there are tons of these, and they date roughly like 5th to 4th century BC, and the scrolls start disappearing after that. Like people aren't buried with them anymore, but we know the Bacchic mysteries are still going around. They were super popular for a while, so I suspect that it was just a question of they no longer thought that they had to have the scroll with them upon burial, and that maybe that was becoming a cause of looting of graves, and consequently they probably declined in the use of this strategy. And that's also actually, you start to notice that the spell scrolls or the curse scrolls turn to lead. So this cheap lead that no one wants to loot graves for started to become the more common way of these rolled scrolls that you would have in graves. But those are usually like curses or blessing. They're usually magic spells rather than Bacchic mysteries stuff. What I suspect is after the 4th century, people were just told to remember it. Memorize it. When you're there, you'll know what to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. Jim Majors just got his PhD in actually in the study of Daniel. So he's
we had just referred to him earlier. Excellent. Congratulations.
He said, I would love to join you guys, but Derek said Dr. Carrier is allergic to mustaches and that Mr. Sheffield was just plain scared. Guys, yeah.
I'm not allergic to mustaches.
He's not. He started growing one when we were in California recently.
There was a reason. I was actually growing my hair out for a cosplay for one of my girlfriend's parties. So I was trimming out a proper full beard and stuff. So a lot of our video has that. I think probably all of it. It shows me with more facial hair than I usually have.
That's all on the Patreon. And then I do want to address our friend Dr. Kip Davis as well. He says this podcast would be much better if you could get these guys to start singing. And
I'm tone deaf. You don't want that. I do love karaoke, but that's because I don't mind being totally terrible in front of people.
He did this the other night and was like, I will sing it if someone throws $100. And sure enough, someone came through and he had to sing this gospel song. Oh, it was funny.
Oh man.
I was kicked out of choir in second grade. I think I had to go to and it was on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That's when I learned I was tone deaf. Kicked out. I had to go to library appreciation class. So even though I'm a big fan of musicals, I love watching The Voice, I am horrible at singing. I can't say I do cartoons good, but singing, no, that's not my forte.
Look, it says, coward carrier, no one is more tone deaf than me.
Well, maybe for $100.
That might be true. I don't know.
I think maybe for $100 donation or super chat, we can get a piano bar type of request.
Oh my goodness. I will say this, Dr. Kip Davis said earlier that there's the possibility, I think he was saying something about Sadducean influence with the Samaritan Pentateuch or something like that. He made a snippet response to that. Didn't really go too much into it, but there might have been something there.
There is actually a lot of weird interconnections with the Samaritans. Like the Essenes appear to be a Samaritan sect, for instance. And when you look at all the sources discussing them, I go into this in that one section I was talking about in the Empty Tomb. There's more sects of Samaritans, and then there's a lot of other sects have interesting ties to Samaritanism. So the Samaritanism mattered a lot more than we get the impression of today.
Wow, interesting. Well, I guess we've run to the end of super chat questions, and we've gone quite a bit. I think this has been really fun. I want to allow you guys just closing comments, if you don't mind, with this discussion. This was really fun.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to fellow Christians and others out there is just really this idea of ethical engagement. I think even in the go out and read the articles. I know a lot of people like the cartoons because they're easier to digest, but there's a lot of good thought that goes into these articles. And I think, and one of the conclusions of the article that I had put out there was, all we're asking is to hear the witnesses or the Jewish testimonies and really engage in ethical dialogue. And I think, back to Dr. Carrier's point, I think there needs to be more interfaith dialogue from this academic, standpoint, which is really going to help build the ministry, get your ideas out there, and, stepping out of our comfort zones to go out there into someone else's home field and share your ideas. And I think, Dr. Carrier, the subscribers of his blog, while they don't agree with me, they're very polite and respectful, and we get to have really good dialogues. And I think this is where Christianity really needs to go with these dialogues. Get the ideas back out there. The early Christians did. They went out there into a much different environment.
Richard?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Actually, as Dennis McDonald would say, as we'll know from people who watch our videos that we cut for this, the only coda I would add to that is that what my evangelism in this is historical methodology, right? So my interest lately has been on methodology, including methodology of apologetics, and also methodology of where methodologies go wrong. So like I've done articles on conspiracy theories and things like that. And how do people get themselves into these belief systems? And so I'm more interested in focusing on that and getting people to realize the methods and the principles that they're using and how they think. And so I want people to look at that. So analyze these arguments to see what is the structure of that and what is that a good methodology for getting to a conclusion? And if not, what do we replace it with? And then so I'm bringing, what do historians today do? Why do they do it? Why are the methods we use the way they are rather than some other way? And then how are some of the common methods that I think people fall into false beliefs, the methods that lead them there? And you can actually identify them and label them and discuss the structure of them and see them repeated in many other contexts. So that's my thing, is I want to get that message out. That's my gospel. I want people to be aware of methodology and how to improve their own methodology, and how to spot when other people's methodologies are not working. And so that's basically the message that I want. And then the only other thing I'd add is to check out my stuff, richardcarrier.info. Everything is there. If you want to look into my classes, my books, my blog, and all my feeds, Facebook and Twitter and so on, are all accessible from richardcarrier.info.
That reminds me, everybody go subscribe. Right here in the chat is Jonathan Sheffield's YouTube channel. You guys are going to see as we go through the outro where I have the gods come visit me in my laboratory, in my office. They're really interested in MythVision. I don't know what the heck has gotten into them, but you guys will get to see that first eyewitness testimony here. You can go and tell everybody about the facts that you're going to see here in a minute. But Jonathan Sheffield was the creator of that. So I ask you guys, MythVision fans, followers, I don't care what you believe, go show my friend some love, subscribe, because he has some interesting stuff. The cartoon, one of my favorite ones, is the channel trailer. That one is super awesome. I mean, no, seriously, you and I'm just gonna scam. Like, I got to give everybody a little sneak peek here. I'm gonna turn the volume down. They can't really hear it because I don't want it to possibly hurt me. I don't know if you have music in here that might mess up.
Oh yeah, right.
But look at this, right? I'm gonna do it at 2 times speed. Your quality is really good too. Let me do it at 1080p. We're gonna go super high quality here. 2 times.
I think it's good. I know Dr. Carrier makes an appearance in here
there
too.
He is. Yeah. That's why I did it. This is his artwork. He does all this, and he's going to face Robert Price is in there.
And I have 2 Christians in there. I just want to let everyone know. I got James White and Daniel Wallace. So it's
right. Yeah. Okay.
This is awesome right here.
Yeah, that's the ultimate Matrix scene.
It's fantastic.
You really went all out with that, dude, and then alive. That is super cool. Seriously though, I don't know what it is right there. Also, go to Richard Carrier's website, richardcarrier.info. You guys read the articles. You can check out the blogs. If you want to take an online course, he does college courses online. You can hire him for tasks. I mean, there's a lot you can do, with Richard Carrier on his blogs, and be able to have him come on to shows if you're interested in talking with him. I don't know. Do you do private consulting, like discussions? Okay.
Yeah. I discuss my rate in the how to help. If people could look at the screen right now, that right in there is a bunch of different ways that you can help support my work, including buying books through my website and so on. But including that is hiring me, what that takes, and so on. But yeah, I do private consults. I do private vetting. So a lot of people will bring me essays for me to peer review for them or comment on. I've been hired for a variety of projects that have ended up on my blog. Someone wanted me to write an official report on the accuracy of a book for a formal report that he was going to file with the BBC. And, I've been hired for a lot of different things like that, where I'll write historical commentary for them or whatever the case may be, and doing engagements like Sheffield, Jonathan has done as well. So I'll do lots of those things. And my rates are explained in there, at least my hourlies. If it's a written project, then you have to hit me up through private messaging or something like that. And then I can discuss the different levels of rates depending on what it is you want to do.
Awesome. Go check that out. It's all in the description. All of this stuff is in the description of this video. Also the Patreon, ladies and gentlemen. You can go check us out. I mean, there's tons of stuff that, you know, Dr. Dennis R. McDonald, Richard Carrier, what these atheists believe. Like, I created thumbnails. This is the one where we talk about the Blade Runner in this one. And it is really good. That one got really emotional, actually.
Yeah,
which was really good. Look at your face, dude.
And a lot of this stuff is only going to be available on your Patreon, or does it eventually go public?
Eventually, some of this will definitely. I don't know when though. When all of this stuff will find its way to YouTube.
But Patreon members get access to stuff. Some of the stuff now.
No, all of it. All of it now.
Yeah.
All of
really?
It.
Oh yeah, all the clips. Like there's 70
every
or
single. Right? More than I've got probably 300 or 400 videos on Patreon.
Oh right.
That no one has seen on YouTube. That's how much content I have on the Patreon. And the 72 videos will all be there early. So what I'm getting at is when this video, which I'll probably launch this sometime, who knows, within the next 2-3 months. I don't know, because it's a matter of how I feel. But by the time this hits YouTube, I'll have another 70 or 140 videos on Patreon that no one has seen. And you can steer the discussion. So like if you join me and you message me, you could say, hey, your next visit with Richard Carrier, ask this question. I take questions from my Patreon members, as we did, and we recorded like 20, 25 Patreon questions.
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was all like your special video in 1080p with this scholar asking, hey, so-and-so asks Dr. Richard Carrier, what do you think of this? And Dr. Richard Carrier responds. So like all of these are, you know, stuff you don't see yet that will finally make its way onto YouTube. And you're helping me keep doing what I'm doing. That's like the biggest reason why I had to leverage some way to make this accessible for, what am I doing? There we go. I was like, I have to leverage it in some way to keep doing this full time. Right. And this is my way of you being able to keep this thing going. So, Look, secret stash, Joel Pearson. But seriously, I appreciate you guys.
Upselling.
I'm upselling. I got to let you know, like, this is my leverage to the wife too. I could be like, hey, I'm working.
Yeah.
I'm working. You know?
It is a good project. I believe in what you're doing. So I hope people will support you.
Well, keep
this channel alive, because you're a great host and you have on a lot of great guests.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. I'll write you the check after. Seriously, now let's get into our outro. But before we do, I want everyone to know, if you're lost, you don't know your way home, it's okay. Come on home. Hey, baby, come on home. We are MythVision.